December 19, 1944, Camp Butner, North Carolina. Snow fell in heavy silence across the pine forests of the American South, a landscape so alien to the European battlefields that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Dr. Carl Schneider stood in the doorway of the camp infirmary, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, watching an American soldier approach through the accumulating drifts. The soldier carried a cardboard box, and as he drew closer, Schneider could see the red cross marking on its side. The young American, barely 20, his face still soft with youth, smiled as he handed the box over, saying something in English that Schneider's limited vocabulary couldn't quite parse. But the gesture itself needed no translation. Inside the box, penicillin vials, still cold from transport, each one representing a small miracle of modern medicine that had been utterly unavailable to German forces for the past 2 years. Schneider's hands trembled as he accepted the box, not from the cold, but from the cognitive dissonance of the moment. 3 months earlier, he had been performing amputations without anesthesia in a collapsing aid station outside Aachen, watching young Wehrmacht soldiers bite down on leather straps as he sawed through shattered bone with instruments he could no longer properly sterilize. He had expected, upon capture by American forces during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, to be shot against a wall or marched into some frozen work camp where he would dig graves until he joined the dead. Instead, he found himself in a heated building with electric lights, treating German prisoners with medications he had only read about in pre-war medical journals, under the supervision of American medical officers who spoke to him not as a war criminal, but as a fellow physician. The soldier waited patiently in the doorway, snowflakes gathering on his helmet, until Schneider managed a halting "thank you" in English. The American grinned wider, gave a casual salute, and trudged back into the storm. Schneider watched him disappear into the white curtain of falling snow, then looked down at the penicillin in his hands, each vial a crystallization of everything Nazi propaganda had told him was impossible, everything his experience in Wehrmacht medical service had taught him to stop hoping for, everything that now forced him to question what else he had been wrong about. This moment of unexpected humanity, repeated in countless variations across the American prison camp system, would become the crucible in which German medical officers' understanding of their enemy and themselves was fundamentally reforged. For doctors who had served the Third Reich, men who had operated within a military medical system corrupted by ideology and starved of resources, the encounter with American military medicine revealed not just a difference in material capacity, but a profound divergence in values, in institutional culture, and in the relationship between power and compassion. To understand the depth of this transformation, one must first grasp the world these German doctors had inhabited before their capture. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps had entered the war as one of the world's most advanced military medical systems, staffed by physicians trained in Germany's excellent universities, equipped with modern instruments and pharmaceuticals, organized according to efficient doctrines developed over decades. German medical schools had produced some of the 20th century's greatest advances in surgery, pharmacology, and clinical practice. German military medical organization emphasized rapid triage, efficient evacuation chains, and specialized treatment facilities that separated casualties by severity and type of injury. But by 1944, this system had disintegrated under the compounding pressures of total war. The Eastern Front's savage attrition had consumed medical personnel at rates that training programs could not replace. The collapse of German supply lines meant that even basic medications became scarce. Morphine, sulfa drugs, antiseptics, anesthetics all vanished from field hospitals' pharmacies. Allied bombing destroyed pharmaceutical production facilities and disrupted distribution networks. German doctors found themselves practicing increasingly primitive medicine, forced to make triage decisions based not on who could be saved, but on who could be saved with the nothing they had available. Dr. Friedrich Becker, captured at Normandy and later interviewed for the U.S. Army's Historical Documentation Project, described operating in a ruined church in France during the weeks before the Allied breakout. He performed surgeries by candlelight, reused bandages that he boiled in salvaged cooking pots, and amputated limbs, not because the wounds required it, but because he lacked the antibiotics to treat infections. He watched soldiers die from injuries that proper medical care could have easily treated: a shrapnel wound that became septic, a compound fracture that turned gangrenous, a simple appendicitis that ruptured before surgery was possible. The professional helplessness corroded something fundamental in these doctors, men trained to heal, but forced to watch young soldiers die for lack of basic medical supplies. This material collapse occurred within a larger moral collapse. Nazi ideology had systematically poisoned German medicine since 1933, introducing racial pseudoscience into medical education, forcing doctors to participate in eugenics programs, and ultimately conscripting physicians into the machinery of genocide. While many Wehrmacht medical officers never directly participated in concentration camp medicine or the T4 euthanasia program, they practiced within an institutional framework that had normalized the subordination of medical ethics to political ideology. The Hippocratic Oath had been rewritten to prioritize service to the folk over care for individual patients. Jewish physicians had been purged from the profession. Medical resources were allocated according to racial and political hierarchies rather than clinical need. Even doctors who tried to maintain professional ethics found themselves compromised by the system they served. They treated wounded SS soldiers who had committed atrocities. They performed medical screening that determined which prisoners of war were fit for forced labor. They signed death certificates for soldiers executed for desertion or cowardice. They operated within a chain of command that valued military utility over human life, that saw wounded soldiers as broken equipment rather than suffering human beings. Some resisted where they could, treating enemy prisoners when regulations forbade it, falsifying medical records to save soldiers from execution, hoarding scarce medications for the most desperate cases. But resistance was limited, dangerous, and ultimately insufficient to redeem the system's fundamental corruption. Wehrmacht propaganda had prepared these doctors for capture with dire predictions. American soldiers, they were told, were brutal occupiers who would torture prisoners for information, work them to death, and show no mercy to defeated enemies. The propaganda drew on American racial tensions, emphasizing lynchings of Black Americans as evidence of savage culture, portraying American society as violent and lawless. It highlighted supposed American war crimes, inventing or exaggerating incidents to create terror of capture. Medical personnel received specific warnings that Americans did not respect the Geneva Convention's protections for medical staff, that captured doctors would be treated as common prisoners or even executed as war criminals for their service to the Wehrmacht. The reality that German doctors encountered upon capture contradicted these warnings at every turn. The initial moments of capture established patterns that would persist throughout their imprisonment. American combat medics provided immediate medical care to wounded German prisoners, treating them with the same protocols used for American casualties. They administered morphine for pain, morphine which German field units had not seen in months. They applied proper bandages, clean and abundant. They evacuated wounded prisoners to aid stations where American doctors performed surgeries, set fractures, and provided the same standard of care regardless of the patient's uniform. Dr. Werner Schultz, captured during the Battle of the Bulge with severe frostbite and a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, recorded in his post-war memoir the astonishment of being treated by an American surgeon who worked with meticulous care, explaining each step of the procedure through an interpreter and checking on his recovery daily. The surgeon, a civilian doctor from Minnesota, conscripted into military service, treated Schultz's wounds as if they belonged to an American soldier, cleaning the shrapnel injury thoroughly, administering antibiotics to prevent infection, and carefully treating the frostbitten fingers to maximize tissue preservation. Schultz had expected, at best, minimal stabilization. Instead, he received treatment that exceeded what he had been able to provide for German casualties in his own field hospital. This pattern of professional medical care, regardless of nationality, reflected American institutional commitment to Geneva Convention principles. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention governing treatment of prisoners of war, and American military medical doctrine incorporated these international legal obligations into standard operating procedures. American military medical training emphasized that medical personnel had professional duties transcending national loyalty, that wounded enemies deserved the same care as friendly forces, and that upholding medical ethics served both humanitarian and strategic objectives. But beyond institutional policy, the kindness German doctors encountered reflected something deeper in American military culture. The American soldiers staffing prison camps were conscript citizens temporarily serving in uniform, not members of a permanent warrior caste. They brought civilian values and civilian sensibilities to their military service. Many were uncomfortable with their role as captors, morally troubled by the war's violence, and inclined to treat prisoners with basic decency unless given specific reasons not to. They came from a society that, despite its profound flaws and contradictions, included democratic traditions emphasizing individual dignity, religious values, promoting compassion, and cultural norms that discouraged cruelty toward the defeated. Dr. Schneider experienced this civilian sensibility in countless small interactions during his first weeks at Camp Butner. American guards who learned he was a doctor asked medical questions about their own minor ailments, a persistent cough, a skin rash, digestive troubles. They treated him as someone with specialized knowledge worthy of consultation, not as a defeated enemy to be humiliated. They shared cigarettes during shift changes, showed photographs of their families back home, and engaged in rudimentary conversations despite language barriers. One guard, learning that Schneider had children, brought a care package his wife had sent and shared the cookies inside, an act of casual generosity that would have been unthinkable in Wehrmacht culture with its rigid hierarchies and prohibition on fraternization. The camp hospital where Schneider was assigned to work became a space where this kindness manifested in systematic ways. The facility occupied a purpose-built structure with multiple wards, an operating theater, a laboratory, and administrative offices. It had electricity, heating, running water, and all the basic infrastructure that field hospitals lacked. More remarkably, it had supplies, shelves full of medications, cabinets stocked. With surgical instruments, storage rooms containing bandages, antiseptics, and medical equipment that German military medicine had not seen in years. The American medical officers supervising the camp hospital treated German medical personnel with professional courtesy that bordered on collaboration. Captain James Harrison, the U.S. Army Medical Corps officer overseeing Camp Butner's hospital, conducted weekly staff meetings where German and American medical personnel discussed cases, reviewed treatment protocols, and addressed operational challenges. Harrison spoke to Schneider as a colleague, soliciting his clinical opinions, acknowledging his professional expertise, and deferring to his judgment on medical matters. This professional respect communicated something profound, that competence and professional identity could transcend national enmity, that medicine constituted a shared enterprise with universal standards that persisted even during war. The penicillin that had arrived in that snow-dusted box became the symbolic center of Schneider's transformation. Penicillin represented the cutting edge of wartime medical innovation, an antibiotic so effective against bacterial infections that it had revolutionized military medicine. British scientists had discovered penicillin's properties in 1928, but industrial-scale production required massive investment in fermentation technology, chemical engineering, and pharmaceutical manufacturing. By 1944, American pharmaceutical companies were producing penicillin in quantities sufficient to supply Allied military forces and even provide surplus for civilian use. German scientists had known about penicillin, had even conducted some preliminary research, but Germany never achieved industrial production. The combination of resource constraints, Allied bombing of pharmaceutical facilities, and the Nazi regime's chronic mismanagement of scientific research meant that penicillin remained unavailable to German forces. Wehrmacht doctors read about it in captured medical journals, knew theoretically what it could accomplish, but could not deploy it. The drug became almost mythical, a wonder cure that might save countless soldiers if only it could be obtained. Now Schneider stood in a camp hospital with entire boxes of penicillin at his disposal. American supply officers requisitioned it through standard logistics channels as if it were aspirin or bandages, as if revolutionary antibiotics were just another routine medical supply. The casual abundance communicated more about American industrial capacity than any propaganda or intelligence briefing could have. This penicillin, manufactured in vast American pharmaceutical plants, distributed through continental supply networks, allocated even to prison camps treating enemy prisoners. It revealed a society operating from such resource depth that it could afford to give cutting-edge medicine to defeated enemies. Schneider used that penicillin to treat Germans, prisoners who would have certainly died without it. A Wehrmacht sergeant with a severe leg wound that had become infected, under field conditions, the leg would have been amputated and the soldier likely would have died from surgical shock or post-operative infection. With penicillin, the infection cleared, the wound healed, and the sergeant kept his leg. A young conscript with pneumonia, a death sentence in late-war German field hospitals, recovered fully after a course of penicillin injections. A prisoner with sepsis from an untreated dental abscess, another with infected shrapnel wounds, a third with osteomyelitis, all survived because of antibiotic treatment that American resources made routine. Each successful treatment challenged Schneider's understanding of the war and of his enemy. Nazi ideology had taught that American society was weak, decadent, corrupted by capitalism and racial mixing, incapable of matching German discipline and organization. Yet here was evidence of American organizational excellence, industrial sophistication, and scientific achievement that exceeded Germany's capabilities. The penicillin was not just medicine, it was proof that the ideological framework Schneider had accepted, however ambivalently, was fundamentally wrong about the nature of American society. The kindness extended beyond medical practice into daily interactions that humanized both captors and captives. American soldiers working as hospital orderlies, men who could have resented being assigned to care for enemy prisoners, instead performed their duties with professionalism and often genuine compassion. They helped German prisoners who were too weak to walk, changed bedding for incontinent patients, assisted with feeding those who could not feed themselves, tasks that required intimate physical contact with enemy soldiers, tasks that could only be performed with basic human empathy. Private Thomas O'Brien, a hospital orderly from Boston, became a regular presence in Schneider's ward. O'Brien spoke some German, having grown up in a neighborhood with German immigrants, and he translated for patients who could not communicate with American medical staff. He brought small comforts, extra blankets when the heating system failed, magazines and books in German that he scrounged from the camp library, occasionally candy bars or cigarettes purchased with his own wages. O'Brien's kindness was unself-conscious, driven not by policy or propaganda, but by simple decency. He saw sick and injured men, and he tried to make them more comfortable regardless of what uniform they had worn. Schneider observed O'Brien carefully, trying to understand what motivated this kindness. In Wehrmacht culture, such behavior toward prisoners would have been seen as weakness, as inappropriate sentimentality that undermined military discipline. German soldiers were taught to maintain emotional distance, to see enemies as abstractions rather than individuals, to subordinate human sympathy to military necessity. Yet O'Brien's kindness did not seem weak. He performed his duties efficiently, followed orders precisely, and maintained discipline. His compassion coexisted with professional competence, suggesting that perhaps strength and humanity were not mutually exclusive. The camp hospital treated more than physical wounds. German prisoners arrived bearing psychological trauma from years of combat, from witnessing atrocities, from watching their nation collapse in defeat. Many suffered what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, intrusive memories, emotional volatility, profound depression. American medical officers, working with German medical personnel, provided psychiatric care that acknowledged psychological injury as legitimate medical concern deserving treatment. This psychiatric attention contrasted dramatically with Wehrmacht culture, which had viewed psychological breakdown as cowardice or malingering. German military medicine had minimal psychiatric infrastructure, and soldiers suffering psychological distress were often punished rather than treated. Shell shock was seen as moral failure, evidence of insufficient warrior spirit. Soldiers who could not continue fighting were sometimes executed as examples, or at minimum discharged with dishonor that followed them for life. American military psychiatry operated from different assumptions. Psychological injury was recognized as an expected consequence of combat stress, treatable through various therapeutic interventions and not inherently shameful. Camp hospitals employed psychiatrists and psychologists who worked with German prisoners suffering combat trauma, providing counseling, medication when appropriate, and validation that their suffering was real and deserved care. This psychiatric care communicated that American military culture valued soldiers' psychological well-being, that human beings had limits beyond which continued function was impossible, and that acknowledging these limits was wisdom rather than weakness. Dr. Schneider watched these psychiatric interventions with fascination and growing understanding. He had seen countless German soldiers break under combat stress, had witnessed the Wehrmacht's brutal response, and had felt professional helplessness at being unable to help. Now he observed American psychiatrists treating German prisoners with patience and therapeutic technique, saw men gradually recover psychological function, and recognized that his profession had failed its psychological casualties not just because of resource scarcity, but because of ideological blindness that refused to acknowledge psychological injury's legitimacy. The transformation in Schneider's thinking was not instantaneous or simple. He struggled with loyalty to Germany, with the shame of defeat, with the cognitive dissonance of experiencing kindness from enemies. He grappled with his own complicity in Wehrmacht medical service, questioned decisions he had made under pressure, and wondered whether different choices had been possible. The camp hospital became a space for this difficult internal work, a place where the practical demands of medical care forced engagement with ethical questions that ideology had previously suppressed. Other German doctors in the camp underwent similar transformations. Dr. Helmut Fischer, a surgeon who had served on the Eastern Front, had witnessed Wehrmacht atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners. He had not participated directly but had known about them, had treated soldiers who boasted of their crimes, and had remained silent. The contrast between Wehrmacht brutality and American humane treatment forced Fischer to confront moral questions he had avoided. In conversations with Schneider and other medical prisoners, Fischer began articulating a recognition that Germany had not just lost a war, but had deserved to lose, that the regime they had served was evil, and that their professional service had enabled that evil even when their individual conduct had been ethical. These conversations occurred tentatively at first, in whispers during night shifts when American supervision was minimal, between men who tested each other's trustworthiness before speaking openly. The camp contained committed Nazis who viewed any criticism of the regime as treason, who reported suspected disloyalty to camp Gestapo organizations that operated underground even in captivity. German doctors who questioned Nazi ideology risked social ostracism, threats, and in some cases physical violence from fanatic prisoners. But gradually, as the scale of Germany's defeat became undeniable and news of concentration camp liberations reached the camps, more prisoners found the courage to speak openly about the regime's crimes and their own complicity. American camp administrators, aware of these internal divisions, worked deliberately to support anti-Nazi prisoners while isolating hardcore Nazis. They segregated prisoners based on political orientation when security required it, protected prisoners who cooperated with American authorities, and provided educational programs designed to expose Nazi propaganda's lies and present democratic alternatives. These re-education programs varied in sophistication and effectiveness, but they created spaces where German prisoners could encounter ideas and information that Nazi censorship had suppressed. Dr. Schneider participated in educational programs that included films showing concentration camp liberations, lectures by American officers about democratic governance, and discussions of international law and war crimes. The concentration camp footage particularly devastated him. He had known vaguely about camps, had heard rumors of brutal treatment of Jews and other targeted groups, but had not understood the industrial scale of the killing or medicine's complicity in genocide. Seeing footage of liberation, the emaciated, survivors, the piles of corpses, the gas chambers, and crematoria, forced recognition that his profession had been fundamentally corrupted, that German doctors had participated in unprecedented evil, and that his own service, however individually ethical, had supported a system that produced these horrors. This recognition crystallized one evening in the camp hospital when Schneider was treating a German prisoner who had served as a guard at Buchenwald. The prisoner, suffering from tuberculosis, required extended care that brought him into frequent contact with medical staff. He spoke openly about his service, describing the camp's conditions with casual indifference to the suffering he had witnessed and enabled. Schneider found himself unable to maintain professional detachment. He provided the necessary medical care, but internally he recoiled from this patient's moral vacancy, from the recognition that he himself had served the same regime, worn the same uniform, and taken orders from the same criminal government. The encounter forced a choice. Schneider could maintain the emotional distance and moral neutrality that military medical service had demanded, could continue treating all patients with equal professional detachment regardless of their crimes. Or he could acknowledge that medicine had ethical obligations extending beyond clinical competence, that doctors had responsibility for the political systems they served, and that professional neutrality could become a form of complicity. He chose the latter, accepting moral responsibility not just for his individual actions, but for his participation in Wehrmacht medical service and the system that service had sustained. This moral reckoning was facilitated by the kindness he continued to experience from American personnel. Captain Harrison, learning that Schneider's family in Hamburg had been killed in Allied bombing, took time to sit with him, expressed genuine condolence, and spoke about the tragedy of civilian casualties in modern warfare. Harrison did not excuse Allied bombing or claim that German civilian suffering was deserved, but he also did not apologize for fighting a war against Nazi Germany. He acknowledged the moral complexity of total war, the inevitability of terrible choices, and the shared human cost that afflicted all participants. This conversation, conducted in halting German and English with frequent recourse to medical terminology that both men shared, illustrated a kind of moral sophistication that Nazi ideology had rejected. Harrison could simultaneously believe that defeating Nazi Germany was necessary, and just while acknowledging that the means employed caused genuine moral injury, that German civilians were human beings whose deaths mattered, and that American soldiers bore responsibility for the violence they inflicted, even in pursuit of legitimate military objectives. This moral nuance, the ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, represented a maturity that Nazi ideology's absolutism had prevented. The kindness extended to practical assistance with family connections. American authorities allowed prisoners to send mail to family members in occupied Germany, facilitated through Red Cross channels and Allied military government. Schneider, learning of his family's death through one of these letters from a surviving relative, received permission to send replies, to maintain contact with extended family, and to begin planning for eventual repatriation. The system was bureaucratic and slow, but it functioned. Letters sent from North Carolina reached occupied Hamburg, replies returned, and prisoners maintained family connections despite imprisonment. This maintenance of family ties reflected American recognition that prisoners remained human beings embedded in networks of relationship and obligation, that even enemy soldiers had families who loved them and worried about them, and that these human connections should be respected and preserved when possible. Wehrmacht culture had increasingly demanded absolute subordination of family to state, requiring soldiers to prioritize military duty over family obligation. American practice suggested different priorities, a recognition that family constituted a fundamental human good that even war should not completely sever. The Christmas season of 1944 brought these contrasts into sharp relief. American camp administrators organized Christmas celebrations for prisoners, providing special meals, decorations, and time for religious services. German prisoners, many of whom were nominally Christian, attended Christmas Eve services led by German chaplains who had been captured with combat units. The services occurred in camp chapels, simple wooden structures erected specifically for religious worship, equipped with crosses, altars, and hymnals provided by American authorities. Dr. Schneider attended Christmas Eve services in Camp Butner's chapel, sitting among hundreds of German prisoners singing traditional German carols. The emotional power of that moment, singing Silent Night in its original German while imprisoned in America, celebrating the birth of Christ in a camp built to contain his enemies, created profound cognitive dissonance. The carols spoke of peace on earth, of goodwill toward all people, of divine love for humanity. How could these words coexist with the war that had brought them here, with the atrocities committed in Germany's name, with the suffering that continued in Europe as they sang? Yet the American guards who stood at the chapel's periphery, ensuring security while respecting the service's sanctity, seemed to find nothing incongruous about facilitating religious worship for enemy prisoners. This too reflected American cultural assumptions, that religious faith was a private matter deserving respect, that even enemies retained the right to worship, that spiritual needs were legitimate human requirements that imprisonment should not completely suppress. The guards' casual acceptance of their own role facilitating enemy religious practice revealed confidence in American identity, a security that did not require suppression of others' beliefs or practices. The special Christmas meals reinforced messages of abundance and consideration. Prisoners received enhanced rations including meat, fresh bread, canned fruits, and sweets. The meal far exceeded anything German civilians were receiving in bombed cities with collapsed food distribution systems. Schneider ate turkey, a bird he had never tasted before, exotic and abundant, with potatoes, vegetables, bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. The sheer quantity amazed him, but more striking was the presentation. The food was served on proper plates rather than being slopped into mess tins, came with appropriate utensils and was eaten at tables in a decorated mess hall rather than standing in a field or huddled in a bunker. This Christmas meal, like the penicillin before it, carried symbolic weight beyond its immediate function. It demonstrated American capacity to provide abundance even for prisoners, to attend to human needs beyond mere survival, and to recognize that celebration and ritual mattered to human dignity. The meal communicated that American society operated from resource foundations so deep that even elaborate gestures of kindness toward enemies were affordable, that strength and generosity could coexist, and that victory did not require cruelty toward the defeated. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, news of Germany's final collapse reached the camps. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was disintegrating after 12. Berlin fell to Soviet forces in May. Hitler committed suicide, and the German High Command surrendered unconditionally. For German prisoners in American camps, this news created complex emotions: relief that the killing had ended, shame at defeat, fear for families in occupied Germany, and uncertainty about what the future held. The revelation of concentration camps' full horror accompanied the news of military defeat. American authorities required prisoners to view documentary footage of camp liberations, to confront photographic evidence of industrial genocide, and to acknowledge the evil committed in Germany's name. These forced viewings were psychologically brutal, but strategically calculated to break through ideological denial and ensure that Germans could not later claim ignorance of Nazi crimes. Dr. Schneider watched footage from Dachau's liberation, seeing American medics overwhelmed by thousands of starving survivors, recognizing medical facilities that had been perverted into instruments of torture and death, and understanding finally that his profession's corruption had extended far beyond battlefield triage to active participation in genocide. The experience was shattering, forcing recognition that everything he had believed about German civilization, German culture, and German medicine had been built on foundations that crumbled under examination. American medical officers, observing German doctors' reactions to this footage, handled the moment with a combination of moral clarity and professional consideration. They did not excuse German medical complicity, but distinguished between doctors who had participated directly in camp medicine and those who had served in conventional military medicine. They acknowledged that individual German doctors retained professional competence and ethical capacity despite their nation's crimes, that post-war Germany would desperately need medical personnel, and that reconstruction required working with Germans willing to acknowledge truth and commit to different principles. Captain Harrison spoke with Schneider after the Dachau screening, addressing the difficult question of professional identity after serving a criminal regime. Harrison acknowledged that American medicine was not innocent, that American doctors had participated in unethical experiments on prisoners and marginalized populations, that American society tolerated racial segregation and medical discrimination, that no profession or nation could claim moral purity. But he argued that the scale and systematic nature of Nazi medical crimes represented something categorically different, that German medicine would need fundamental reconstruction, and that doctors like Schneider, who recognized the truth, bore responsibility for leading that reconstruction. This conversation planted seeds for Schneider's post-war life. He began to see his captivity as preparation for a different future, as education in how medical systems could function when properly structured and resourced, as learning that would be essential for rebuilding German medicine on ethical foundations. The kindness he had experienced from American personnel, from Captain Harrison's professional respect, to Private O'Brien's casual compassion, to the penicillin deliveries on snowy evenings, all constituted evidence that a different kind of society was possible, that power and humanity were not inherently incompatible, and that German culture might transform rather than simply being destroyed. The repatriation process began in 1946 and extended through 1947 as American authorities processed German prisoners for return to occupied Germany. Medical personnel received priority in some cases, recognized as needed for addressing public health crises in devastated German cities. Dr. Schneider was among a group repatriated in spring 1946, transported by ship to Bremerhaven, then distributed to medical assignments in the American occupation zone. The Germany he returned to was unrecognizable. Hamburg, his home city, was approximately 40% destroyed by bombing. Infrastructure had collapsed. The economy was in ruins. Millions were homeless and starving. The medical system was overwhelmed by malnutrition, epidemic disease, and massive casualties, needing ongoing care. Hospitals operated without adequate supplies, power, or clean water. Medical personnel were scarce, many having been killed or still imprisoned. But Schneider brought more than just medical training back to this devastated landscape. He brought experience of functional systems, of institutions properly resourced and ethically oriented, of professional practices respected and maintained. He brought relationships with American military government medical officers who could facilitate supply deliveries and institutional support. He brought lessons learned from observing how American military medicine balanced efficiency with humanity, how abundant resources changed what was clinically possible, and how professional identity could be maintained even under difficult circumstances. He also brought the penicillin, not literal vials, but the understanding of what antibiotic treatment made possible, the knowledge of proper protocols, and the connections to secure supplies through American military government channels. This knowledge allowed him to save lives in post-war Germany, just as it had saved lives among German prisoners in North Carolina. The antibiotic became a thread connecting his imprisonment to his post-war service, a symbol of transformation from defeated enemy to reconstruction partner, from practitioner in a collapsed system to builder of something new. Over the following decades, as Germany rebuilt and the Federal Republic emerged as a democratic state and American ally, the experiences of German POWs in American captivity became part of the foundation for reconciliation. The kindness that men like Dr. Schneider had experienced, the penicillin delivered in snowstorms, the professional respect from Captain Harrison, the casual humanity of Private O'Brien, the Christmas dinners and psychiatric care and maintenance of family connections all contributed to a sense that Americans were not simply conquerors, but potential partners, that the democratic system they represented might offer something valuable, and that former enemies could become friends. Dr. Schneider maintained correspondence with Captain Harrison for years after the war, exchanging letters about medical developments, about Germany's reconstruction, and about their shared experiences of war's aftermath. Harrison visited Germany in the 1950s, meeting Schneider and touring the Hamburg hospital where he had established a modern medical program. The two men, former captor and captive, enemy and enemy, had become colleagues united by professional identity and by the recognition that the human capacity for kindness could survive even total war. The penicillin that had arrived on that snowy December evening in 1944 became, in Schneider's memory, the symbol of everything that transformed during his captivity. It represented material abundance that enabled humane treatment, scientific achievement that transcended nationalism, professional standards that persisted across political divides, and the practical demonstration that democratic societies could compete not just in violence, but in creativity, productivity, and moral vision. That antibiotic, manufactured in American pharmaceutical plants and distributed through American logistics networks to treat German prisoners, embodied the soft power that would prove more durable than military victory. The power of abundance freely given, of professional respect offered to defeated enemies, of kindness extended when cruelty would have been easier. As Dr. Schneider aged and reflected on his life, he often returned to that moment in the infirmary doorway, accepting a box of penicillin from a young American soldier whose smile conveyed no hatred, no triumph, just simple human decency. That moment, he came to believe, contained in microcosm the difference between the system he had served and the one that had defeated it, not primarily a difference in military capacity or industrial might, though those mattered, but a difference in fundamental assumptions about human dignity, about the relationship between power and responsibility, about whether strength required cruelty or could accommodate compassion. The kindness that German POW doctors experienced in American captivity was not universal, was not without limits, and occurred within a context of devastating war that Americans had helped prosecute. But it was real, it was systematic, and it challenged the defeated to recognize that their ideology had been wrong not just about military balance, but about the nature of democratic societies, about the compatibility of strength and humanity, about the power of abundance and generosity to transform enemies into partners. That recognition, born in prison camp hospitals across America, carried by men like Dr. Schneider back to devastated Germany, became one of the foundations for the transatlantic alliance and the democratic reconstruction that followed. The snow that fell on Camp Butner that December evening in 1944 covered the same earth, whether it fell on American guards or German prisoners, on pine forests or barbed wire, on a nation at war or a future seeking peace. And in that democratic snow, falling without distinction on victor and vanquished alike, there was perhaps a lesson about the shared humanity that even the most terrible wars cannot completely destroy, about the power of small kindnesses to plant seeds that outlive the conflicts that spawned them, and about the enduring truth that how we treat our enemies reveals more about our own character than any victory parade or propaganda poster ever could.